Hello and welcome to another episode of Virtual Legality. I'm your host, Richard Hoeg, managing member of the Hoeg Law business law firm of Northville, Michigan, and the watchword today is hypocrisy. Now, this is a Virtual Legality extra episode, which means we're not going to be talking so much about the legality or business of what our topic is today, but instead just commentary on how various members of specific industries can engage in hypocrisy. In this case, the industry being video games and the member of that industry being Sony and their PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5 products. Now, before we get into it, we're going to be talking about hypocrisy and censorship with respect to Sony. I do want to start out with first principles. The first principle here is that Sony is well within its rights to determine what is allowed to operate on its system. Now, that's actually a statement that is not the least bit controversial to me, but is somewhat more controversial in the wider internet, especially as Epic and others try to break open things like the Apple iOS ecosystem and control whether or not they can keep certain aspects of content or applications off their systems. Believe it or not, this question is actually ancillary to that one because, like Apple, like some other operators in various technology spheres, Sony and the PlayStation ecosystem is what we call a walled garden. Sony reserves the right to review what goes up in its store and to determine whether or not you can actually sell it through their ecosystem. They also take a little bit of a broader right to say you can't sell it at all, even in disc form. And so we get the right to certify what operates on our system, which is even more robust of a power than Apple and some of the other folks are claiming in the fully digital sphere. But Sony has done this time and time again, especially in the recent past, told developers that they can't sell their game on the PlayStation for reason X or reason Y. Today, that reason is gratuitous violence, which is where the hypocrisy question comes in. Yesterday morning, a company by the name of Wired Productions put up a tweet that said the following about a game that is to be released this month on PlayStation, Xbox, and computer. The game is called Martha is Dead, and here's what they had to say. Martha is Dead PlayStation Update. Martha is Dead is a narrative adventure recommended for adult audiences only, with play consisting of potentially discomforting scenes and themes that may distress some players. Both Wired Productions and LKA have always been open and honest about Martha is Dead content, with these sensitive depictions in play consistently communicated to the media since the game was announced in 2019. This content is also flagged clearly and repeatedly within the game itself before play begins. Now, that's the first paragraph as we talk about here. We are going to talk about messaging a little bit, just not Sony's. This is the kind of thing that is designed almost defensively from the get-go. They're establishing that what has happened today, what has happened this past week, presumably in terms of their own communications, was something that shouldn't have happened because they were clear and concise in communicating what this product is to their business partners, including Sony. And yet, here's the second paragraph, it is with regret that we have had to modify the experience on the PS5 and PS4 versions with some elements no longer playable. After over 4 years of passion and hard work, developer LKA now requires extra time to make these unplanned changes. Martha is Dead, as a result, will still launch digitally on both PS5 and PS4 on Thursday, February 24th, 2022, but the physical retail release will be delayed to a yet-to-be-disclosed date, although we anticipate this to only be a small number of weeks. So you see a couple of things just in those statements. You see unplanned changes. You can see between the lines that Wired Productions, LKA, likely feels that this should have been caught earlier. That's what that first paragraph is about. Now the second paragraph saying, hey, nobody had plans for this. Certification at the Sony level came back with these comments when we don't think that should have happened. The game is available on Steam as it stands right now. This all should have been taken care of before we're on the eve of having to get discs out to retailers. And yet, here we are. Our physical edition, says the publisher, will still contain the bonus content of a double-sided poster, digital tarot cards, Martha is Dead digital EP. We will update players with the date we ship this edition as soon as we have the information. And then a little bit of a punch over to Sony. The PC and Xbox versions of Martha is Dead are both unaffected by these developments and will launch with the full, unedited gameplay as planned. We look forward to players experiencing the work of LKA on Thursday, February 24th, 2022. Now, you'll note a couple of things in this statement. They don't actually talk about what the issue is here with any kind of particularity. We're going to talk about what some people on the internet think it might be, but understand this game is out there in the wild. If you or I haven't seen news items about absolutely ridiculous things in this game before now, they likely don't exist. We're speculating, of course, as I have not played Martha is Dead, and to be frank, it's not the kind of game that I would play in any event. And yet, people point to this particular scene as potentially troubling. This is apparently a scene in the game in which a person's face is cut off. That's not my kind of game, to be honest with you. A gratuitous violence in games isn't generally my kind of play experience, but there's a lot of things in the world that aren't my kind of play experience. Sony, again, going back to first principles, is fully within its rights to say we don't want gratuitous violence on our system. And the artist, here the developer, is fully within its rights to say we view this as useful to what we're trying to sell. In a horror game, there is some usefulness to being uncomfortable, to feeling like you don't want to be seeing these things. In fact, that's oftentimes what somebody playing a horror game is looking to experience. And I don't limit this to horror games. That also applies to horror novels or horror movies. Not wanting to be there, not wanting to see this thing is part of that experience. It's part, if we're being honest, of the art, even if you or I don't like it in specific circumstances. But it gets worse from there, right? A couple of things are happening in this scene. I'm not going to play it for you. I don't really want to anger the YouTube gods or algorithms or bots or whoever's controlling our livelihood here in virtual legality on this day. So we won't do that. But effectively, there's a couple of things happening. One, it's exactly as depicted here. There's somebody that's going to cut off this person's face, and they're asked to do small little things with their mouse button as it happens. It looked to me like you hold down the button and you slide it to the left, you slide it to the right, and then an action sequence takes over. It's not like you're tracing out anything, but there is a certain amount of playability in this scenario. Now, of course, I'm making this video for exactly the same reason I might tweet about it, and I tweeted out a few hours ago, it's pretty freaking rich for the makers of torture porn nihilism simulator The Last of Us Part 2 to censor a game for graphic violence of the type described, which is what I want to talk with you all about today. Now, a couple of people have defended The Last of Us Part 2, said there's nothing like that in there. I wholeheartedly object to that particular defense. If you go and you look at The Last of Us Part 2, just even in the teaser form, and this scene didn't appear exactly in the game, but this is certainly what Sony is selling in this form. There's a man with a hammer that breaks somebody's knee. One of the other men with a hammer gets an arrow through the throat here. There's other instances directly in the game of you actually having to go and perform extended stealth kills. And again, this isn't my type of game, right? I've reviewed Last of Us Part 2 here. It's one of our most popular videos on this channel, and I had issues with the narrative, but the narrative was very specific. It wanted to talk about nihilism. It wanted to talk about the pointlessness of pursuing revenge, and that it won't fulfill whatever life needs you think you have. But it did this by showing kills and gratuitous violence and absolutely extreme circumstances throughout its running time. This, understand, is a game developed by Naughty Dog, a wholly owned subsidiary of PlayStation. This is a game that Sony has specifically allowed for this purpose. It's evaluated the art and found that this kind of thing is great. This kind of thing leads to whatever emotional resonance they want their product to have, and it can be allowed on their system, when this cannot be. Now, you might look at this and say, well, those are quantitatively different, Rick, and I don't disagree. Obviously, it is. But when you're talking about selling a horror game, I think it's useful to point out that while Sony might have the right to say, yeah, this is fine, totally fine, everything's okay, we can criticize them for saying this isn't okay, especially when they aren't slated to make the same amount of money as they make with this and this and this. Right? Sony is trying to sell hardware. Sony is selling hardware through the release of games like The Last of Us and The Last of Us Part 2. Better yet, Sony doesn't have to pay itself 30%, or more specifically, that same 30% goes to itself, so it has an advantage there. If sex and violence sell, and I think there's evidence in certain quarters that they do, Sony is monopolizing its own power to only allow itself to sell on those quarters by otherwise limiting your ability to operate in the sphere that they operate within. Now, it's also worth noting that Sony is not having its first rodeo here in virtual legality. We have a long-form playlist around this very game from 2020 called The Last of Us Legalities, where we watched Sony one by one eviscerate the common usage of the DMCA to take down things like references to the plot of The Last of Us Part 2, take down pictures of objects unrelated to the assets in their game, but related to the plot points within it, and get in trouble doing so. We saw them go so far as to accidentally strike their own video using a third-party resource because they were so aggressive in pursuing these DMCA claims and knowing that they could run out the clock before having to bring any kind of federal court action whatsoever. This is what Sony did in the summer of 2020 to defend this game, which is clearly gratuitous in its violence, going so far as to actually have articles and articles written about ending that gratuity. Right, I'm not on the same side as Julia Alexander here of Polygon saying stop using extreme violence to sell your game. It's not my kind of game. I don't tend to like extreme violence, but others do, and I'm not the only member of the marketplace. But I am the kind of guy to make a commentary video like this one that says, Sony, if you're going to allow this kind of stuff on your particular system, you should really think hard about whether you're going to decide to censor other people's art that they think is useful, that they think is, I believe they use the word discomforting, because that's what they're trying to achieve with their product. Now, can you go too far on that? Of course you can. I haven't played this game, so we are speculating a bit. Maybe there is more stuff out there than just what is shown. But if you hate what is shown, if you find yourself outraged about it, feeling uncomfortable about it, understand that in some respects, that's the nature of what that publisher is trying to go for. And it certainly looks like that effect has been achieved. And certainly the fact that it's allowed on the Xbox, which is at least somewhat corollary to PlayStation in terms of its position in the marketplace, what an M rating can get you, suggests that Sony is going further and further than even its most recent competitors in the console space. Now, if you're Nintendo, I can understand this kind of position. Nintendo is selling into a very specific place. Nintendo is selling without trying to put forth, especially first-party games that are gratuitously violent. And so I think that's a little bit more defensible if this type of game were to go onto that system. Nintendo reserves that right and really isn't hypocritical in it because it's not making the same kind of games at the same kind of time. Sony is instead banking on it. Sony is banking on it so much that they're willing to go let's say a little bit extreme with the way that they pursue their legal avenues here. Now, a number of people came into my comments to the tweet that I put forth in this video and gave defenses, and they're defenses I'd like to talk about. One, Lee Bull on Twitter, I don't agree with the censorship. It's a good start, but there's nothing in TLOU2 on the level of what's been depicted in Martha is Dead. Let's be realistic. This has probably put Martha is Dead on many more people's radars. Overall, sales will probably be higher than if Sony left it alone. And I can only say I hope that they are higher on a system that isn't otherwise censoring the art that the developers made. So good for you, Xbox, maybe at the end of all this. But I also reject the notion that this is distinctly different. I don't know how many of you that are watching this or listening to this have played The Last of Us Part 2, but the entire running time of that game, which is very, very long, is designed to make you uncomfortable, is designed to have you observe these characters that you otherwise played as in part one descend further and further and further into madness, and is designed to make certain characters that clearly enjoy the violence get more out of that violence as you proceed. And in terms of whether or not anything is different from Martha is Dead, I would only offer, spoiler alert, I guess, for a 2-year-old game, that not only is the photorealism in The Last of Us Part 2 higher from all looks that I can see than Martha is Dead, it is often reveling in what is happening in a way that is, to me, more disgusting than actually trying to disgust you with what's happening on screen. There is an absolute puerile sense of enjoyment of the violence in The Last of Us Part 2 that I find much more uncomfortable than just a horror game trying to do horror things to freak you out. So that's my position there. The second item here is it could help them have sales. That's all well and good, but we don't have to defend acts that are otherwise hypocritical or bad and otherwise reserve our ability to criticize the people that are engaged in those acts simply because we think that they were stupid and somehow helped this company essentially against what they would otherwise do. So while it might help sales, and I don't think a lot of people knew about Martha is Dead before any of this, that to me is no defense of Sony taking these acts when they otherwise sell these things for themselves. Another defense that I saw pretty often here, this article calls it a minigame. Do you think there's an argument for controlling and inflicting violence? I haven't played TLOU since launch, but I remember more of the gratuitous stuff in cutscenes. And indeed, the stuff that I'm showing here is cutscenes. Even this is a cutscene. And so when we talk about these various things, they are most photorealistic in cutscenes, but that's not the only place where these things happen. This is the entire game of these kind of kills, this kind of gratuity, this kind of violence. And if the mini game is what's throwing you off. One, I think you stalk these people and you hit a stealth kill button is roughly the same as holding down the button and sliding left or right in Martha is Dead. But if you're really concerned about that, I would offer instead God of War 3, made by Sony Santa Monica, again, a wholly owned subsidiary of PlayStation. This is what they sold to gamers in God of War 3. This is you mashing down the circle button in order to punch and slam and kick Helios. This is you punching the left bumper and the right bumper in order to tear this man's head off, resulting in imagery like this. Now, you might say, hey, Rick, that's cartoony, but they're trying to be as photorealistic as possible when God of War 3 and God of War 3 Remastered comes out. There's really no indication that they wouldn't go in this direction with God of War if they couldn't. And in fact, the God of War Revival is significantly more photorealistic than this. The point being that Sony is banking on violence and in God of War, sex, to sell their game, and otherwise telling folks that are engaged in similar activity that they need to get off their system in a manner that, at bare minimum, I find to be unfair and hypocritical, and potentially more. Again, I stand for the proposition that Sony has the right to do this, that Apple has the right to control what's on its ecosystem, that Microsoft has the right to control what's on its Xbox. But we've seen even recently that Microsoft has tried to say, no, we don't, that they want to open up the App Store. Now, that's a little bit self-serving, as we talked about in the video that we mentioned earlier this week, but they have gone forward with very specific steps that they want to see in the operation of application stores, presumably like the Xbox Store eventually, and the PlayStation Store and other stores that sell digital goods. And number 6 here is the most important. We will treat apps, read apps as games, equally in our App Store without unreasonably preferencing or ranking of our apps or our business partners' apps over others. Preferencing. We have certification standards at Xbox. We have certification standards at Sony that say gratuitous violence is not allowed, gratuitous sexuality, whatever. Gratuitous there meaning outside of the bounds of what is needed to tell the story, to actually perform the art, to get that emotional response that you might otherwise be looking for. We are against that. And yet, at Sony, we're going to sell you God of War 3. We're going to sell you The Last of Us Part 2. We're going to sell you other games into the future, I'm sure, that feature violence in order to sell tickets to the show. And yet we're going to tell others that that's not allowed. We're just a family-friendly unit. Power to the gamers. Play has no limits except the ones we put on it. And so I look at this and say they're entering into a very dangerous area, right? In our earlier videos, why did we say that Xbox was doing this kind of thing? Why are they moving forward? Yes, it's to open up the store. They want to sell Game Passes. They have a self-serving interest, but it's also because they can read the wind in the air. They can see where politics is going. They can see that the more you look like you're acting hypocritically, the more you're Amazon positioning your products better than others, the more you're Sony allowing yourself to develop a Last of Us Part 2 and otherwise cripple, potentially, the ability to sell what other artists and other publishers and other developers want to sell in your ecosystem that could potentially compete against you and make them change their art so that they might be able to less compete against you, is going to look bad for regulators and legislatures and jurisdictions across the world in relatively short order. Now, I don't know what way the laws are going to go. I don't know what way the regulations are going to go. Microsoft thinks they're going to go one way. They're trying to get out in front of it. But Sony, by continuing to raise the walls of their walled garden, by declaring themselves tyrant kings of that walled garden in a way that looks potentially bad for those of us on the outside, is no way to run a railroad, and ultimately, I think, is pretty dangerous, if we're being honest, especially in the West, for how legislatures and political bodies are looking at this. Finally, in terms of this hypocrisy, I just want to point out, I've loved video games my entire life. I've grown up with them. And the more these console holders act in loco parentis for every possible mature theme, every possible bad screenshot or bad thing that they think our virgin eyes should be kept away from, the more video gaming continues to be put off in the corner and never participate in the mainstream discourse. Movies, books, television, and more have thrived on presenting you with uncomfortable situations, asking you to deal with your humanity, every great thing that art can do. And Sony instead sees this thing as somehow limiting. If we're giving them the full benefit of the doubt, oh, our Last of Us is artistic, but that isn't artistic. All right, let's assume Sony is completely acting in good faith there. They are still keeping developers away from exploring mature themes in a way that every single other medium can do. And Sony, remember, is the leader in console sales of a specific type. We could talk about Nintendo, but as I said, they're not really a part of this conversation. And then they're leader in potentially allowing those mature themes to be explored. And when they do these kinds of things, video gaming as an industry suffers. And that's why you get a virtual legality extra from me, because I love this industry. I want to see it continue to explore those themes. I worry about Sony getting overly regulated or overly ambitious, and I want games to be able to explore these things. We've talked about the chilling effect here in virtual legality before. It's not just the fact that Sony's censoring Martha is dead. That's one specific instance. It is about the fact that every developer and every publisher sees something like that, and in Sony's case, has seen it again and again, and now has to judge the resources it's putting into its own products to go into a walled garden that has a massive user base controlled by a single company in Sony, and decide now, for a game releasing 3 years from now, whether or not to even explore those themes. And if they decide no because of acts like this, I think something of value is lost. I'm very happy for the PC space and the openness there. I'm very happy that Xbox appears to be taking a less rigid approach to things like this. But certainly, as a fan of Xbox, as a fan of PC and Nintendo, and a fan of Sony, I would see them not do this kind of thing, or at least not do this kind of thing without a fulsome explanation about why it's not hypocritical and why we shouldn't worry about it, as I am here in virtual legality. If you enjoy these conversations about business and law, usually we talked a little bit about corporate messaging today and the industries that you and I both love, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. We cannot do it without the support of viewers and listeners like you. You can check out a link to Patreon in the description to this video. Also, I'm having conversations much like these ones, intellectual and analytical, in the Seasoned Gaming BITCAST every week, 11 a.m. Eastern. It's a 2-hour podcast. Please do check us out there. We're growing very rapidly. I think you'll enjoy the conversations if you check them out. Otherwise, just subscribing, putting these on Reddit or Twitter, and telling your friends that we exist helps the algorithm, helps grow subscribers, and the more subscribers we have in this space, the more YouTube likes us and shares us around with others. If you caught this on YouTube, thank you so much for watching. And if you listen to it as a podcast, thank you so much for listening. And I will catch you on the very next episode of Virtual Legality. Virtual Legality is a YouTube video series with audio podcast versions presented as commentary and for education and entertainment purposes only. It does not constitute legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. If you have legal questions about the topics discussed, please consult your own legal counsel.